Okay, so welcome to our final week of the course and our final session online. Let me just adjust this volume. And Henry mentions he's a little stuck in one part of the assignment, which may be the biggest one, which is a little bit concerning, but hopefully that may be able to be resolved this evening, or you resolve it soon before it is due in a week or so's time. So before we get into this evening's topics, do we have any questions about your second assignment?
Yes, I do. I don't
Okay,
know if Hadis has any. The part where I'm stuck is I already went through all the. I used the socio-ecological system, and then when I tried to transfer that, I had difficulties trying to understand what they mean by the chrono part. I forgot the.
Okay,
The
yes, the chrono one is fairly unique. That's one I actually came up with. So it's not completely widespread in the use of socio-ecological theory, but essentially there are certain times or certain aspects of a socio-ecological system which are time dependent. Now, the most common ones I could refer to that in terms of education might be beginning teachers, teachers that have been around for quite a long time, and for teachers that are getting close to retirement. Now, each of them will have a different perspective on many of the aspects that you're looking at, depending upon where they are chronologically in that time frame. It might also be a new principal or a new school leader who has only just come into the role or has been in the role for quite a long time or has been very experienced in the role and maybe is looking at moving on from that role. So they'll all have different perspectives on the environment that they're working in, and there'll be different influences that will affect each of those. A beginning teacher will be influenced by things around getting used to the role of teaching and surviving, particularly around lesson management and student management issues and things of that nature, whereby a much more experienced teacher won't be necessarily influenced by those factors, but will be influenced by other factors. And a teacher that's close to retirement will be influenced by other factors still. Strangely, we find teachers close to retirement quite engaged with change and with new technologies. You would think that they might not be considering so much about that, but it's surprising that we find a lot of them are quite engaged with that. Mostly because they can draw upon their long experience of change and of coping with new introductions of approaches and technologies and so forth. And they have that capacity to support those sort of changes, whereby someone in the middle career and certainly someone in the early career may not have those capacities. So that's where that Chronos system is involved, where there are certain things that aren't described by the different groupings, but are described more about the time frame of those individuals within those groupings.
Okay. And my second question was basically mostly is about the how we can develop the document. So when we are in the part where we are talking about the future of the system in 1, 5, and 10 years, and then we have the levers for change. For me, it's logical that I should actually introduce first the levers for change, so then I can talk how this will help to see or to vision the future of the school in 1, 5, and 10 years. So we're free to actually
Absolutely.
move the.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
because for me, it makes more sense to do this just like the proposed action. So I put the levers, the proposed actions, change management plan, and then show how this will affect the system in 1, 5, and 10 years.
Yep, no, absolutely.
So
the structure that you've been provided with is just an example structure, and the same with the word limits. It's just an example of what an approach to the task would involve, but you're free to make modifications around that. Certainly all those elements need to be included because you'll see those in the criteria, but how you structure them, the ordering and the weighting you give to them can vary with your own particular circumstances.
Okay, yeah. So that was the part where I was stuck. So I was trying to make the logical connections and the structure of the document, but knowing that I can move it around, and so it makes sense when I'm explaining how the whole process goes. It's easier.
Absolutely. Now, there's been a few comments in the chat while we've been going. Hello, yep. Okay, everyone's just welcoming themselves to the course, which is good. So, for those online, Hadis and Connie, do you have any other questions about the assignment? Good, Hadis is fine. Connie would like to know where you have discussion on levers for change and stakeholder alignment strategies. Okay, yes, I know what you mean there. What's the question, Connie? Yes, you'll discuss those particular aspects and you'll identify what levers of change or what levers you'll have to influence change on the individuals. So essentially, you're trying to get their alignment with what you want to see happen. So you've got a plan of certain things you want to see occur in your organization. Various stakeholders will need to be influenced to be supportive of your plan, and the levers of change are those things that will influence those stakeholders to be more supportive of what you want to see happen. So you need to think things from their perspective. What are they particularly interested in? What will get them to support the changes that you're proposing? And that's what socio-ecological modeling allows us to understand and develop strategies around. Does that answer your question, Connie? Or if you were doing it in relation to what we were just discussing with Henry, yes, you can change any of the sections of the structure of the assignment. If you find certain sections should be done earlier or later, you're free to rearrange them as you suit your particular writing style and approach to the task. Okay, so your internet might be back messing up a little bit. Okay, any other questions about the assignment? Okay, and the sub-points under 9. Develop a plan to manage the change process with consideration of. It could be anywhere in the assignment, right? Yes, it can, but essentially those points are there to help you explain how you're going to ensure the long-term achievability of your plan. Most of the rest of the assignment is about setting up the conditions for your plan to be successful. Those elements under number 9 are more about how you're going to ensure that the plan will carry through to fruition and develop what you want to see occur after you start the plan going. Most of the other stuff is about developing the plan and getting everyone to come on board with what you're proposing. Things in section 9 are more about how to keep the plan going and see that it survives in the long term so that what you want to have occur comes about. So the majority will be mentioned under the They could be, or they could be done in a separate section at the end of the assignment. Generally, the 1, 5, and 10 years section is more about framing what you would like to see occur, how you want to see your plan develop over the next 10 years. The things in section 9 are about ensuring that that occurs. So I guess you could include that in those year breakdowns, but they don't necessarily have to be done in that approach. I can't see offhand anything wrong with doing it that way, but that wasn't how traditionally it's been done. Those other considerations have been more generally when you write a research assignment and so forth, you look at what things might be needed for the future. And this sort of fits in with the same sort of framework. What could be done next? How can we sustain things? How can we make sure that if there are major changes that they'll be reviewed and we can update the plan as necessary over time? And things of more practical aspects to your planning, while the rest is more theoretical in terms of developing up a plan. Section 9 is about the practical aspects of keeping the plan going. Okay, well, let's get then into this evening's topics, where we're looking at processes for transformative change. So thinking back to that SAMR model, where we had replacement and augmentation and things of that nature, and the final evolutionary process was to achieve transformational change, where we can see things happening completely different to how they happen now, through the use of technologies that enable us to do things that transform the way education occurs in our educational institutions. So it's not just about making minor changes to things because of technology. It's about making wholesale, massive change that is done in a completely new way that we couldn't do without the introduction of those technologies and other processes such as project-based learning and things of that nature. So let's share the document and hopefully you've got some questions about it all. So the first bit is just on a web page that breaks down the idea of transformational change. And it does so in a range of categories and provides a scaling process again, as we've seen in lots of our examples, where we go from a minor change through to a more significant change through to a larger change in the future. And in this case, they've called it enabling, pushing, and empowering, or historical tendencies, emerging practice, and future direction. And so the first aspect of transformational change is the challenge involved, the degree to which the level of difficulty is used in order to grow the capacity for learning and performance. So this is really challenging our students to go beyond what they currently do. Or it might be challenging teachers to set activities and assessments and the rest that are at a higher level than what we currently expect of students. And within this, there's a range of cultural pressures and characteristics to achieve this sort of change. And we have some examples. So if you move your mouse over these various activities, you'll see some examples. So here's an example from the student's perspective. Tanya is expected to find out that there are unlimited retakes for her maths exams. So having this whole process of having unlimited retakes will make a major change to how she might go about her learning process and assessment processes, where she can continue to take tests until she masters the material and passes it. So it's quite a different way to how we've traditionally done, in this case, assessment. And from a teacher or faculty perspective, the example here is around a nursing program where many of the students have difficulties with financial aid, and there's a process put in place whereby they can do things in the community and identify problems and go through this aspect. So it's a new nursing program, spending time on campus. Okay, that may be more specific to a particular context, but you get the general idea. You can go through and have a look at these examples, but there's little snippets that show you how the idea of challenge can transform the way we approach education. By reframing what we consider challenging to increasing the level of challenge, we can change the way we go about doing things. And there's various examples through that. Another one is around cognitive complexity, similar to challenges, but here we move from memorizing material through to trying to understand that material through to problem solving based upon our understanding. So shifting things in terms of education in that perspective. And again, here we have an example from Frank. So he's being asked here to come up with 3 possible explanations about why something occurs, rather than just learning some particular content about whatever they're meant to be learning in this case. Other ones, control, so moving from teacher-centered or faculty-centered through to learning-centered, through to the learner-centered, where the student is involved with making decisions and having agency over what occurs in the school environment. We'll just have a couple more, then we'll pause for you to give commentary. Delivery, so moving from basic presentations through to having more discussion during lessons and lectures and so forth, through to active learning processes, whereby we set activities where students have to demonstrate their learning and go through processes where they're actively learning rather than passively receiving information or being involved in discussions. The design process of learning can be transformative. So moving from a rigid set approach where maybe we're using a specific learning management systems approach or use of lesson plans, through to modularizing that so we can mix and match various activities, through to making responsive systems that change depending upon the capabilities of students or the interests of students. Then you've got efficiency transformations, moving from doubt, where staff are doubtful whether or not something's going to be effective, through to willingness to try, through to being convicted and really, really supportive of a change. And we've talked about that in a few other contexts. Having processes for efficiency, where we've got a base level of evaluation, but then moving towards having regular progress reports, through to actually formal assessment of our processes, where we actually have measurable standards that are then tested against and continuously improved upon based upon those standards that have been set for our organization. Measurement's another one. So being focused mostly around subjects and subjective determination, where we have a range of things that we want to see achieved and we make some subjective determination as to whether or not that's been achieved, through to categorical determination, where we achieve around sets of outcomes rather than specific outcomes, through to objectives, where we set the objectives of what need to be achieved as the primary focus of our measurement elements of our organization. Ownership's another one. Again, moving from student agency, where students are directed in their learning and the teacher is deciding upon what is learnt and how it's learnt, through to a guided process, through to self-directed, where students make their own determination about what they learn and how they learn it. Relationships, where staff are emotionally distant and don't want to become personally involved with students, through to being emotionally available, where we allow ourselves to actually discuss things with our students about how they're going, what they're feeling, their out of class experiences, etc., through to being emotionally invested, where we really care about what's happening in students outside of class time and are trying to actually actively improve their engagement with the course, their interactions with their friends, and all of those elements that might be involved in a school environment. The scope of their learning, through to situational understanding, then where we just understand the things we learn in a particular situation, through to understanding the focus of the discipline. So for example, in education, we try to get a better understanding of how education is working as a whole, through eventually to interdisciplinary understanding, where we want to understand, for example, how education might be working with business or with the arts or with the sciences, and how that interaction between disciplines can be important to understanding the whole scope of learning. Last three, self-awareness, where we have our being self-conscious of what's happening in our learning, through to regulating our learning process, where we understand that there might be certain times when we learn better, certain moods we have to get into before we're effectively learning, through to focusing on self-growth, when we try to develop environments and situations where we're becoming better learners because of our enthusiasm or our growth mindset or the circumstances that we're in, which might be we find we work better in groups or when we're challenged or when we have set deadlines and a whole range of things around that nature. Social orientation is whether things are focused on the individual, collaborative activities, or community-based activities. So whether or not the projects or the learning activities are focused just around our own needs, our group needs, or the community needs, and they might be international needs. And then we have transparency, where we keep everything private and restricted, with our limited exposure and understanding about what's happening in a course or our own learning or what's occurring in a university or school, through to making everything public and open and transparent. So that's just a range of measures that exist around this concept of transformational processes. Now, no organization is going to do them all at once, and you'll need to decide what level of transformation you want to achieve for your particular learning organization for your assignment. But it provides you with additional material to think through what are some of the things that you could consider about trying to change in your learning organization. How far might you want to go? What are the sorts of things that you want to see change in the larger, bigger picture aspects of your organization? So do we have any questions or comments about any of those elements? It's a fair bit to engage with. There's a lot of different concepts in there, and certainly you wouldn't be expected to engage with all of them at once. Often you might just pick one or two in an organization and see if you can achieve transformation in that respect. Or commonly you would split up the transformational burden and give different groups within an organization responsibility to try to achieve transformation in different areas. But as an educational leader, there'll be times when you need to set the overall priorities and try to achieve transformation where that transformation requires the entire organization to get behind a particular strategy and approach. So, any thoughts?
I think that one of the most interesting things is that it comes with examples from, like, for example, when you go to the cognitive complexity and you see how it goes from rote learning to actual skill development. And the examples, I think, it help you a lot to understand actually what we are used to and how it, the ideal of education should be. So what I see here is that they are doing that's the same movement from traditional pedagogies to progressive pedagogies. And I think when we are doing this plan, we have to keep that in mind, like what kind of pedagogies we want to use. Because usually most teachers like changes. It's sometimes it's a myth that they don't want change. Sometimes they like change. But when you introduce something new, that's when they get a little, they start to show some resistance to change. So I think that showing them how this kind of process will happen and how we are moving from something that was very traditional to a more progressive way, that doesn't imply that you have to transform everything at once and that you can do it as a gradual process, like they call it there, like an emerging tendency. I think that that's a very good idea to actually handle the steps in how you are going to create a plan to introduce the transformation and introduce innovation in the system. This particular way of explaining for me was actually very interesting because it gives you an idea and then it gives you tips on how to move from one point to the other. And then at the bottom, I realized that they actually show like connections to other things that you can look for, like in the cognitive development complexity. Then you read at the bottom, and it shows you that Bloom's taxonomy has a lot to do with it. So it's like, oh, so this is something I can use. And Bloom's taxonomy is great for performance indicators. So it's like, oh, what I want from my organization is this. Bloom's taxonomy will help you. Like at the end of 10 years, teachers will be able to, and you describe the situation, the future, and it's actually easier for you to come with a very very well, I don't know how to say that, structured plan that actually go for sustainability, which is the issue sometimes, because when there's no one leading the project or leading a change, then it tends to stop and nothing happens. So actually, if you start by getting everyone on board, you can get the project to be an ongoing endeavor for everyone at school. So that's very interesting, and I that's what I liked about the website. Then I started looking around, and actually, it's a company that produces software for school management and things like that. And they say that their philosophical principles and the pedagogies are from several. I mean, they are not focused on one. Of course, if you can see there's a little bit of constructivism in there, but they draw from several things. So it's like sometimes you focus only on one way of doing things, when then you can include others that can help actually. So it's like seeing what works and what will help in a organization to move forward can help. And the progression system from red to green, it gives a visual indication too.
No, absolutely, and there's some good points that you raised there. And our DIS mentions that it's complicated, and I believe we should be aware of every stage that an organisation involved in is making changes. Connie also mentions the guideline to show the organisation is progressing in the right direction. And Hadis also mentions, I don't know what might happen during the change or changes. Some groups might just get the disadvantage of change. And yes, there will certainly, any change would involve change by its nature, and there'll be some advantages and disadvantages. What you need to do in your plans is to highlight the advantages and to try to minimize the disadvantages. But there will be some times when you do have to cope with disadvantages. And that's where part of your planning is to try to convince the stakeholders that are going to be disadvantaged that there are other advantages that might compensate or be more important than the localized disadvantages that might occur for them. And hopefully that they've got a bigger picture and they're supportive of larger influencing factors that you can use so that they're willing to accept that disadvantage for an overall benefit. Now, if the change is going to disadvantage everyone, then obviously you shouldn't be making the change because it's a negative change. But in the main, most of our changes will at least advantage our students, And that can be a very big influencing factor or change lever for most educators, because we'll often prioritize student benefit over our own disadvantages. Even if it's something to do with our career or your family life or a whole lot of other things, because we highly value benefits to students. Now, there is some criticism of this particular approach, where we're looking at all of these factors along progression timelines. The clearest way I could explain that is it doesn't provide a system level understanding of how all of these things interact with each other, where they generally present a range of linear progressions, but a systems model thinking gives us a much more complicated way of looking at how all of these interactions occur. Now, it would be a very, very complicated systems model, so no one's really come up with it at this stage. Of course, to present all of that and all those interactions would just be very, very involved. But as we've seen with systems thinking, it does provide us with better understanding of the complexities of the interactions between these various trends and factors than just looking at the linear sequential cause and effect models that this tends to highlight. So the main benefit of the model that you're looking at is that it provides you with a whole lot of ideas and looking at a whole lot of possibilities. But when you actually have to come to achieving them, there are advantages looking at it from a systems perspective rather than just the more simplistic linear cause and effect model as it's presented as. Okay, any other comments about that? Okay, so I commend that document to you as you do your planning for your implementation plan. It can prompt you with some additional ideas, particularly around the bigger picture aims of your plan and what you're trying to achieve overall with the various approaches that you're considering. Hopefully by now you're getting lots of ideas, probably too many, but it's always good to have a few more to have as part of your mix. Let's look at the next document. Okay, so this one is a report developed by Microsoft looking at educational transformation in a range of schools that they studied and examining the various factors that are important when we're trying to achieve educational change. So, oops, let's get the mouse going. So here we see, again, we've got our vision statement on the left. There's a range of aspects around leadership and policy setting, which is what you're focused on in developing your implementation plans, about coming up with a strategic plan, having a mechanism for quality assurance, having partnerships in the process, and developing capacities for teachers and leaders to achieve the changes that we want to try to achieve. That's been a relatively new understanding around change. The whole idea is that we actually have to train our leaders in schools and our teachers to be able to achieve change. And if they don't have the training to be able to go through the processes as we're doing in this course of planning effectively for change and putting in mechanisms that will see a change occur and getting everyone on board for a change, then despite the wonderful ideas they may have, the change won't be effective because it simply won't be implemented effectively. And then in terms of what we're changing, the Microsoft framework sets out the 21st century pedagogy. So 5 main things that will change: curriculum content and assessment, inclusion and accessibility, personalized learning, learning communities, and learning environments. And together, that's all put together as a designing technology for efficient and effective schools. So using technology to support both leadership and policy factors and the actual changes we want to see occur in schools in relation to 21st century pedagogy. And it's a whole series of papers that they drew these ideas from. And we'll just briefly have a look at some of the main aspects. So the first concept they came up with is this idea of having anywhere, anytime learning for all, so that everyone will be able to learn whenever they want or need to, and it can occur at any time and wherever they are. Transforming with a strategic planning and organizational capacity and sustainability, that's a little bit more abstracted. Quality assurance as a factor. Equitable access and accessibility as a key factor, making sure that everyone has opportunities to engage with education, be they students with disabilities or various ethnic groups or gender groups, because there's still a major factor around getting girls having equal access to education on a global level. Having curriculum that's suitable, in this case focusing around the real world, so having educational outcomes that are going to assist students when they leave school. Personalizing their learning, and so having learning that's designed for individuals rather than individuals just having to accept mass learning activities, regardless of whether or not they're particularly suited for their own learning approaches, the time that they can devote, the pace of learning that might be occurring, the various pedagogies that may be suitable for that particular learner or not. Creating support communities to achieve all of this, and again, building leaders and educational, or building the capacity of leaders and educators to achieve these transformational approaches. Okay, so they break that down again into things such as where, what, and how, and various elements within that they look at. The idea that all change needs a champion, that change won't occur just naturally, but someone needs to champion change. And it may be a school leader, it may be a teacher or groups of teachers, it may be the community, it may be governments, but someone has to initiate change. The creative approach has been quite new, where the idea that we should be focused on creation rather than consumption of knowledge and of learning experiences, and having students more actively engaged with doing things that are more creative and producing something rather than other approaches. The whole area of communication has changed primarily as a result of technology, where we can do things internationally and communicate internationally now and be much more involved in communication. But there's also a whole area there around artificial intelligence and being able to have technology to communicate with us, even though we may not necessarily be communicating with a human being. And celebrating is another factor we often forget. The idea that we need to celebrate achievements and milestones and student progression and acknowledge those factors in teaching. And they put all that into a nice little diagram that you can have a look at. Okay, so lots of tables that you can explore and get ideas from. Let's just jump down to where they put together their conclusion. Okay, here it is. And they've just done it as a Wordle, so not that particularly useful there. Questions and comments from this particular document? Again, lots of ideas and possibilities. And how did this document speak to you? Did it give you any ideas that you could use in your planning?
I think that one of the things that you always have to consider that it's a good lever for change is policy. Because somehow, when you are looking for resources and you want professional development for teachers and you want support of that nature, if you use policy, you probably can get those stakeholders to support your cause. In this case, the transformation. So that's why I think they have the policy there and the quality assurance. So to a degree, it requires to be a little bit of a managerialistic view, I will call it. Like you have to manage this thing because if they are putting money into it, they want to see results. So you have to be very careful when you design the outcomes of the plan to something that is actually achievable. You cannot, I mean, daydreaming is fun, but you have to be realistic of what you can do and with what you have. And that's usually where projects tend to fail because it's good to have high expectations, but sometimes you have to consider that there are other things that may affect. And like, that's when you start to understand that the chronosis, the system there is like things in change in time. So you can have a new principal that doesn't support the idea, or teachers that are moving the school, or things like this kind of things. So it's something to think about.
No, absolutely. And that whole aspect around management is something that practitioners often have difficulty understanding. Of course, we're so focused around doing things that this idea of people sitting around and working out plans for doing things it seems a bit of a waste of time. But when you've been in systems long enough and you've seen approaches fail, that's when you come to appreciate the importance of managerial processes and planning and policy setting, where a lot of it is pie in the sky type stuff when they're being constructed. But in the main, they're developed by experts that have seen things fail and seen certain things succeed. And they're trying to come up with measures and advice on how to make things occur more effectively. And that really is just what policy documents are. They're guidelines and instructions on how to do things where experts have considered that this is the best approach for doing it. Normally, in most organizations, policy documents aren't so rigid that you have to follow them exactly. They're provided as guidelines. Of course, most people realize that any particular situation will need slightly different interpretations and application of policy. A policy developed for one particular instance will not work in another circumstance. So good policy documents allow for that and allow enough flexibility for organizations to modify the policies. And that really is what the whole planning process then becomes. Otherwise, those that were creating the policies would create the plans. The plan is really the localized implementation of policy. Policy sets guidelines and frameworks and advice that your plan relates to a specific organization and a specific organization within a time frame, and how that organization could go about achieving some of the ideals of the policy within their particular constraints. And that said, those constraints can change over time, particularly if a plan is successful. That will change the entire dynamics of an organization. And so in 10 years' time, if your plan has been successful, then they'll need a completely new plan, because your organization will be now able to achieve far more than what you might have been able to achieve in your particular circumstances. And a whole lot of new opportunities, a whole lot of new technologies, new staff will all have been introduced into your organization. And so you'll need to do things in a very different way to how you will have been doing things with your current planning. And that's in particular where we get to that section 9 of your plan, where you start thinking about how you're going to build in processes to evaluate how effective your plan has been. When do you need to start putting in a new plan? Now, sometimes that might flow out for the entire length of your planning. Sometimes in the future, they may decide your plan is going so well and not everything's been achieved yet, but it's doing a really good job, that they'll keep it working long beyond when you thought it should be finished. But also sometimes it might be worked out that it's failed. It hasn't achieved what it's intended to do, and it needs to be revised and a new plan developed long before you expected it to go its full course. So that's all certain things that you can consider when you do that section 9. A few comments from Connie. The curriculum content is now all related to the real world, which is a good thing. And students get to learn practical skills that are useful in the real world. But she doesn't really understand what the purpose of partnerships for employability are in this reading. Okay, that is a particularly US-centric approach, and also one that was fairly focused around the Microsoft study. It's really got to do with a lot of companies in the US that are putting in place mechanisms to work with schools to help improve the employability. So Microsoft has programs to help students go through and learn about computing and then be more employable in the computing industry. So does Hewlett Packard and Oracle, and most of the big US companies have got very big initiatives in schools to help them on a pathway through schooling into employment. We don't tend to see that in Australia and in most other countries. We don't have the size of the companies and the culture in our countries where companies strongly support the education system. In the US, that's a very dominant culture. They're very philanthropic, where companies are expected to contribute back to the community. And we don't tend to see that in most other countries. More's the pity, because it is actually quite a good model, although I'm sure there are negatives to it somewhere. But in the main, that's a particular thing from the study that relates to US context. So not something that's especially useful in our particular context in most other countries. Any other comments or statements about that particular reading?
Well, going back on what Connie said, it's really interesting that you mentioned employability because in Colombia, that's what's happening. They're trying to develop skills in students when they graduate so they can find a job and join the workforce. So what they are doing is that they are making alliances with tertiary institutions so they can get certified on something. And one of the things that the Ministry of Education said the country needs more is actually software developers, people who have experience in coding, in computer hardware and mobile application development. So when you think of technologies and the way they're moving, this is actually a good business. And Colombia doesn't even have like the infrastructure for all these kind of things. Yet a lot of people want to learn about it and they have to go somewhere else because in the country they can find it. One of the reasons I chose this master's is when I learned that it had a focus on digital. It was like I couldn't find anything. I had to look for a master's degree, and most of them were focused only on teaching practices, not actually on developing new teaching practices through the use of other ways, because there's basically no one doing it back home. So employability means that when you go back and you teach them actually how to code, we were discussing that once, I remember, when they go out and they try to find a job and they have some experience, or at least they can do some coding, they probably will have better opportunities and they will actually start a career, because mostly these companies will give you a scholarship or will provide some kind of training for you. Back home, usually it's not big companies like that, but banks, the ones that do these kind of things. So they hire the students and pay for them to learn something that will eventually work for them, either software development or whatever. I mean, they have many programs. So these skills, employability is something that you have to consider too, because besides, we're educating for something that we don't know. We're educating for the future, but we don't know how the future is going to be. So we have to be at least giving them some tools to be prepared for that kind of world.
No, you raise some good points, and it is a somewhat controversial aspect. Certainly it is occurring, and in the main, it highlights a deficiency in our education system where companies see that they need to step in and support the education system by providing their own programs that will assist students in their learning. We're seeing that in Australia to a large extent. A lot of the companies were stepping in and supporting the learning of computing in terms of coding and things like that. Of course, they didn't see the education system providing that, and they knew that they were going to need a lot of new employees in those fields. Now, ideally, our education system would be responsive enough to meet those demands, but we also have to think about the purpose of education. It's not just about preparing for employability. Certainly that is a significant aspect, but educating students for the sake of education is also a very valuable aspect of education, making them a more well-rounded individual, being able to think critically, being able to consider things from different perspectives, and those elements. Going too far down the vocational approach to education can be problematic because it can narrow students' opportunities. If you're just trained to do one particular job and then that job disappears or that whole employment area disappears, then you can be in a lot of trouble. And you need an awful lot of retraining then. Whereas if you've been given a more general education, then ideally you should be able to fit into almost any job with some minor additional training and preparation. So yes, it's certainly an aspect that needs to be considered, and particularly where there are high shortages in different areas, there will be the incentive to introduce these areas. We're even finding it in education at the moment. There are certain areas in education where universities aren't providing graduates fast enough, and some of our departments are wanting to set up their own processes to train teachers, provide them with master's degrees and even PhDs and things like that, because they're not seeing the university system and other education systems providing what they need for industry. So education organizations have to be responsive to the needs of industry, but they shouldn't be driven too much by them, because there are still wider societal benefits to a more general education than just the requirements needed for a particular employment area. But it's certainly a thing that you should consider in your implementation plans, and it can be a fantastic way of gaining funding, particularly for educational technologies and other initiatives. If you can find certain levers and consider these industries as stakeholders in your educational technology plans, then you can utilize them to support your plan through various measures, including providing funding for various aspects that you may want to introduce into your organization. I do that a lot with various companies and quite successfully have been able to identify what they want to see happen, and I want to put forward what I want to see happen. And in the main, a lot of companies will be very supportive of what we want to achieve, because they do have a philanthropic perspective as well as a purely commercial focus on developing additional capacity for their companies. They will want to see a better educated country just because they're citizens of that country, and they can see long-term benefits for a better general educated populace. But if you can find particular things that they are especially interested in, then they're much more likely to be supportive of what you want to see achieved in your own planning. Now, Connie also mentions she sees the relationship, probably because I'm thinking from an early years perspective, so couldn't connect it. Yes, in the main, for the early years, we focus almost entirely on a generalist education. We don't really worry about vocational aspects. But that said, Dewey did encourage the idea of introducing real-world learning experiences or vocational learning experiences to very early parts of the education system, where students are learning about how shops work and how building things and metalworking and woodworking and all that sort of work as a way of contextualizing their learning. So it's not entirely limited to the older years, but certainly it is more of a focus as students progress through their schooling, and they're more focused around employability as the next stage that they'll be engaged with in their life after their education. Okay, other comments or questions? Okay, well, we're moving through the readings fairly quickly. Let's have a look at the last one then. So this one is again from Microsoft, because they've spent a lot of money and focus on exploring these issues, is about how to go about the transformation process itself, and in particular school transformation processes. And they've developed 6 stages. The first stage is an inspection process, and as we've seen in our process, it's focused around developing a vision, establishing what you want to see achieved, and making sure that people are on board with that vision that you've decided upon. Then there's a process of research and inquiry, looking at what might be possible. And we've been doing that throughout this course, looking at all the different things that could be achieved, the different technologies that could be introduced into educational organizations, the different pedagogical approaches, the different transformational approaches that we're looking at this evening. So trying to get a scoping of all the what's possible. Then the next step is your stakeholders, engaging with stakeholders and involving them with the decision-making processes. They call that inclusion, but it's making sure that everyone is included in the process, primarily because if you're included in the process, you're much more likely to be supportive of the process. If you're excluded from the process, it's natural to feel reluctance to being engaged with the process because you see it as being imposed upon you rather than something that you've been involved with in developing. Step 4 is bringing about the vision. They frame this as innovation, but this is how to actually implement your plan. In this case, it's looking at what it would look like in reality, and you're doing that through your scenario writing of 1, 5, and 10-year perspectives of what your implementation should look like into the future. They've described it in slightly different terms, but around the idea of an innovation. Then you've got the process of implementation, how to actually make it occur, and the various things that need to be done to achieve that. So I'll just zoom in on that if I can. That's a little bit better. Maybe. Let me just go out a little bit. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see the full left-hand side there. I can see it on mine, but so various approaches to achieving their planning. Having meetings, constructing various approaches, piloting them, which might be again something you can consider. We haven't talked much about piloting and trialing, but often if there's going to be a major change implemented in an organization and you can't convince everyone to go with a wholesale implementation, you may be able to convince people to support a trial of your implementation. And that may be a necessary staged process where you trial it first on a smaller scale, demonstrate that it works on a small scale, and then move on to implementing on a larger scale across the entire organization. And then finally, there's a process of reflection and continuous improvement. And we focus on those elements in section 9, but it's looking at how you can sustain your initiatives, how they can be measured and evaluated, and how you can then ensure that they'll continue on into the future. So that's another brief model of how you can go about an implementation plan. Thoughts and comments?
Actually, the documents were very helpful when you were thinking about the planning process. But at a point, it was like there's too much there anyway because it gives you a lot of indicators on how to do it. I think it's actually it's so well designed that you can see it as a framework actually to approach the process of planning. It's visually helpful for me, at least it was. I don't know for everyone else.
Connie Henedis, what do you think about that? So Hedis says, yes, it was helpful for me because it was organized. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's nice at this stage for you to start looking again at that overall picture of your planning process. So as you get bogged down in the individual elements, start thinking back at what you're trying to achieve overall. Now, certainly your vision statement should define that, but it's also useful to see overall how the whole process fits together towards developing an effective implementation plan or transformation plan for your organization. Connie, any thoughts? Okay. Clear and straightforward. Wonderful. So essentially, you've now been given all of the frameworks and models that you should need for developing your own implementation plan and demonstrate that in your second assignment. Are there any other thoughts around the second assignment or any areas of the process that you would like clarified? Or indeed any elements of the entire course that you would like clarified as we start bringing things to a close? Is there any part of the course that you've still unsure about or would like more detail on or clarification on? Is there anything you were hoping to learn that you haven't learned?
I think there's a lot to absorb. The last classes have been like, there's a lot of things that we have, like learning how the socio-ecological model works and now how to see how it relates to everything else and then connect it to the systems thinking. It takes a while, but as you start making the connections and see how it all works together, it gets easier, but it was a lot of information.
It is.
So,
yes. No.
So yeah, sometimes the readings were like, you get a little lost, and so the classes actually were helpful because it's like, now that's what it means. Now I see how it, because sometimes you couldn't connect it with what we were discussing or the assignments. So actually seeing it in action is very different.
Now, I certainly agree entirely, and it does take a while to put all of these things together in your mind. That's why we do it over an extended period of time over the course. But they are significant factors, and I've chosen these as a range of factors involved in educational planning and policy development and research. But there are lots of other factors that we haven't looked at. There's probably at least 3 or 4 times more things that could have been incorporated into this process that haven't been incorporated because you've only got certain capacity to engage with new material and new ideas. And as you probably mentioned, it's been fairly busy in terms of bringing all of these new concepts into what you're thinking about in terms of implementation plan. But what we've looked at is certainly going to stand you well if you can bring these things into your own planning processes in your own organizations, be they at an individual school level or class level, through to at a governmental level, involving developing policy for a whole nation. The processes don't change. It's just the scale of what you're trying to achieve tends to change, but the impact upon students can be just as dramatic in a single classroom versus an entire country. But you need to frame your own thinking around that and what your interests are and what you're trying to achieve. Certainly we've got quite a few of you that watch this course online and have developed a whole range of plans, from the military to the universities through to other education organizations. And it was good seeing those in your first assignment. And now you'll need to go through the process of, again, thinking about what the focus is for your organization and how you could develop a plan that will be most beneficial to your organization. The only other stakeholder that we probably haven't considered is your own. And as we bring this course to a close, you do need to consider your own interests in developing these plans. It may be around prestige in terms of gaining promotion or recognition or leadership opportunities. It may be simply around improving the outcomes for your students. It might be around improving the organizational outcomes, where your interest is in improving the outcomes for your school. Or it may be you've got an interest in improving the educational outcomes of the entire nation, and you're trying to do things at a national level. So you need to think about what drivers and levers there are for you to implement the change and to sustain the change. Of course, change can be difficult, particularly if it is opposed. And if you're not particularly committed to a change, then it may be best not to attempt it, because you may not be willing to commit enough effort and support behind it to sustain it over the long term. And it's generally much better to do nothing than to do something and have it all fall apart, because that then makes it harder for the next person that wants to implement change. Of course, they've got to overcome the inertia and disaffection that people have felt about the previous change. And you may have found that yourself in organizations where a leader has come in and tried to do something and it's failed, and then they've had to bring in a new leader and they've got to overcome people's resistance to change because of their previous experiences. But that said, sometimes you may come in following a really good example of change where it's been very successful, and now you're looking for new change to occur, and people are very open to change because of the good experience that they've had in the previous iteration of change. And that can be a nice opportunity to be able to implement change, because you can get people on board much more easily because they can see the advantages and the opportunities in undertaking such changes. Okay, any thoughts about those statements?
Just one question. I was wondering, in our assignment, we should think about like our organization, implementation should be like budget friendly or something like that, or no, we are like, we are not thinking about these things, because in my country, a good kindergarten, actually, it's expensive. And I'm, as a teacher, I love to implement something that it's actually budget friendly for, and it's applicable for everywhere. So should we talk about the budget or not?
Okay, yes, you should, because budgets are always a constraint. But remember, this is still a university assignment, so it doesn't necessarily have to reflect the real world constraints. If the reality is you just can't achieve, or if the probability is that you just probably couldn't achieve what you want to demonstrate in your country or circumstance at this moment, then you can certainly ignore that and introduce your own ideas as to what might be possible with an unlimited budget or a more reasonable budget. And then hopefully at some stage in the future, things might change in your organization or your country, where there is more support towards achieving these changes. And then you could use your plan to go ahead and achieve it. That said, you won't be penalized in terms of the assessment for trying to achieve something within the constraints of a real world situation. So if you wanted to find things within a very tight budget framework and possibly negative support, and you can show some ideas and approaches to addressing those, even though it may not be highly likely that they'll be successful, that will still be fine as an assignment. But likewise, if you simply just want to ignore those and say that you've got support and say that you've got budget access and so forth, and demonstrate the conceptualization of what you want to achieve in this assignment, that's fine as well. I've got no way of determining the real world circumstances of your organization. From my perspective, they're all made up. Now, for your own benefit, it's ideal if you can actually come up with a plan that will actually work for your organization, because then you can actually put it in place in your organization. But from an assignment perspective, that's not at all required. You could make everything up to do with your organization if you wish. Does that help, Hadis? Okay, I think you've said fair enough. Good. Any other thoughts? Okay then, well, we'll start wrapping things up for the course. So this course has taken you on a journey through various stages of engagement with educational technologies, where we started off looking at a range of different ideas around pedagogy and content and things of that nature, where we looked at the research processes, the different teaching approaches that can be done in various educational systems. Then we looked at future studies and how we can examine what might occur in the future. Then, of course, we looked at a range of educational technologies. We looked at learning management systems, virtual reality, a whole range of ICTs, and all of those elements. Then we looked at what's been traditional in education systems and the leadership processes we can put into place in those educational systems. And we looked at how educational systems are changing. And finally, this evening, we've been looking at transformational processes, where we can effect really significant change in terms of educational as it relates to educational technologies. So as you work on your final assessment, think back over the course and all of those elements that you might be able to draw in towards your implementation plan. And I look forward to reading those when you've got them done and submitted in a week or so, a couple of weeks' time. And then I'll get those back to you and we'll see how you've gone. Connie asks us, for the assignment, or for assignment 1, are there any feedback in the assignment or just the general feedback that I saw in the comment section? Okay, Connie, if you can look at the comment section and the rubric. Together they provide you with the feedback. In a few cases, I've provided annotations on the documents themselves, particularly highlighting spelling mistakes or particular glaring errors in that respect. But in the main, I've provided just brief summaries in that feedback section. If you'd like any specific queries answered, I'm happy to answer any specific questions you've got about your assignment. But in the main, they were all well done. No one failed, which was good to see. We had a couple of students get very high marks, but quite a few of you just provided a reasonable response. There were a number that didn't necessarily address the criteria as well as they could have. So make sure when you come to the second assignment, you look at the criteria, look at what's generally expected. There were a couple of instances where people didn't really go through the process of systems analysis. And so while you had nice descriptive narratives, didn't really show an understanding of systems thinking and the use of systems models. There were a couple of cases where people developed surveys rather than Delphi studies. And while surveys are certainly a valid approach to research, that wasn't necessarily what was asked for in this particular task. So I had to penalize that to a certain extent. But overall, they were all good examples of an examination of your educational organizations, and they all showed greater insight into the educational organization as a result of going through the process of the Delphi study or survey study that was conducted, and they are all in a position to be able to support you in going on to looking at your second assignment. But again, given some of the misconceptions that a few people had in the first assignment, make sure you go through the process of doing a socio-ecological study and examining things from that perspective in terms of the influencing factors that will be needed to get the stakeholders on board with your proposed implementation. That's probably the main conceptual one that exists in this second assignment. And other than that, address the various elements that are in the assignment. The word limits and the word structure, the word limits for each individual section are just advisory. You can modify that. You can modify the order of things, but look at what the criteria are and make sure you address those criteria. Because that's what I do when I go through and mark it. Even though you may have some fantastic other concepts and ideas put forward, I'm limited in terms of marking and giving recognition only to those elements that are defined in the criteria. So please make sure you address that criteria as we've been discussing the assignment over the last few weeks, and as is detailed in the task sheet and the rubrics. So Connie, does that answer your question? Wonderful. Okay then, well, if there's no other questions or comments about any of the elements this evening, we'll draw things to a close. It's been wonderful taking you through this journey into educational technologies and new approaches to learning, and I hope you've all gained something from that. I would encourage you to provide feedback on the teaching and course. That feedback is always very appreciative, particularly when it's positive, and it does certainly reinforce what should be continued in the course. Otherwise, I end up changing things when they may be working perfectly well. So please give positive feedback. If you have to, of course, give some negative feedback of areas that you didn't find useful, and ideally try to provide advice onto how things could be changed to make them more useful for you where you've had negative aspects of the course. That makes it much easier for me to improve things rather than simply knowing something didn't work and then having to come up with something new. It's much better if you could identify what would work better for yourself, and then I can take that into consideration in improving things for later years. So I hope you enjoyed things, and I wish you well with the rest of your course and program, and look forward to seeing some wonderful things from you in your assignment.
Thank you. This was
everyone.
my first experience in an online class, but I think I did well. I learned a lot.
I'm glad that you learned a lot. That's always the main focus of our courses. If you weren't learning, then that would be a bit of a problem. But no, I think it's been a good course. Not as many online as I'd hoped for, but I understand that many of you wish to participate in the course in different ways, and you're certainly welcome to do so. Thank you especially to Henry for being such a good sounding board for the conversations we've had during the course. It makes it so much easier than me just lecturing, which is not the preferred approach at this level of education with what we've been discussing.
You know, I should actually start a Delphi survey, because the same thing happened to me in other classes. So apparently I'm the one who likes to talk a lot and say a lot of things, or maybe everyone else is just too shy. And I say, well, this is our chance to say something, you know, that's how you learn.
Absolutely, Henry. And different people want to engage with courses in different ways, and that's perfectly okay. But I've been very appreciative that you've been willing to do so. And it's good to see that both Connie and Hadis are graduating soon, and that this was Connie's last course. So congratulations, Connie, assuming you pass, of course, but I'm sure you will, and then you'll be able to go on and do some wonderful things with your new master's degree. So thanks again, everyone, and all the best. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.